All right, cool. Um, so, hey everyone, welcome to this kind of supplemental OER20 podcast on kind of what it looks like for Reclaim hosting to scale in the. Um, I'm Meredith Fierro. I'm the interim customer support manager, and I've been on for about 4 months now, which is kind of weird to think about. But and I'm joined with Jim and Lauren. Lauren and Jim, if you kind of just want to introduce yourself for what you do at Reclaim.
Jim's pointing to me, so I'll go first. I'm Lauren Brumfield. I'm the Director of Operations at Reclaim, and excited to be here. It's obviously crazy with the turn of events over the last few weeks, and I know we are all looking forward to being at OER in person. So the fact that ALT has allowed us to move this into some sort of remote fashion and still connect as a community, I think is really, really cool. And I'm happy to be a part of it, even in this small way.
Yeah, and I want to echo what Lauren said. Thank you all for going fully online. I can't imagine the Herculean amount of work that is taken to do, so we appreciate it. And I'm Jim Groom. I work with these two awesome people at Reclaim Hosting.
Cool. So I just kind of want to talk about, in my presentation, I'm kind of talking about the tools that Reclaim uses to make a scalable support system that then supports even more than just the admins that we train up and the shared hosting users we have, and we just kind of build the relationship with our schools. So then that way the community becomes exponentially larger in the sense that the admins are then comfortable with training their students, and then their students are comfortable training on, and so on and so on. So I don't really have much of a like structured discussion for this, just kind of things that like you guys think of as we talk. Prefer to talk about those. And I'll just kind of open it in the sense of like the tools that we use. We use Discourse for community forums where people can come in and talk about the tools they're working with, ask questions, learn some more documentation on like specific processes, and then just WordPress in general, which is kind of more the wrapper of domain of one's own, which I think is another good tool we can talk about, and just how we use that as our personal documentation that we write blog posts to kind of talk about what we work through, and then also as like the main tool, I think for most of our users in general is WordPress for sure.
Yeah, and kind of even before going into WordPress, because I feel like you could take that in so many different directions, and we obviously have with our different documentation routes and things like that, but it might be worth starting with talking about Discourse, the first one you mentioned, and maybe just, I guess, going through our mindset for why we have stuck with Discourse all of these years. I think that internally there's been this discussion at different points, should we be moving to Zendesk internal support, which it pairs really well with our support ticketing software, and would obviously integrate really nicely for folks that have specific questions. But the reason that we have moved beyond that or didn't really integrate with that from the beginning is because we wanted to involve our community more. We wanted to have those external conversations and put all of the learning out in the open and not just in the ticket with the specific individual. And so, while that makes sense from an individual perspective, you're writing a ticket and they've got these support tickets that are, documentation articles that pop up that, that could be really cool, but you miss that community element and that dialogue that's happening around the work being done. And so I love our Discourse forums, the community forums that we have, because you have folks like Alan Levine, or a ton of people that get on there and there's, they've got their own workshops happening and they're using our documentation forums as a place for some of that, for that conversation. You have students, faculty, staff that are getting on saying, has anybody ever dealt with this before? What do you do in that way? And so as a result, we've written documentation articles, but then a conversation is happening beneath the how-to. And so I find that is almost more valuable than the this how-to steps that we have written. So that's something that I really love about the way that our documentation works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've found too, we were getting these like niche environments like Paul Hibbets with Grav too. Like he's putting his documentation on our forums too. So we're getting people from all over working with different tools coming to community to then it's really cool to see just the learning that happens through these niche communities for sure.
I was thinking about that very one, Paul Hibbets, who does a lot of amazing work for the open source content management system known as Grav. And one of his tutorials for working with syncing Grav with GitHub has over 50,000 views, far more than any of our tutorials for the stuff we're doing, which, can go to 2,000 to 3,000 views. But that's great because they can be found online. Anyone who's looking to do something with WordPress or with Omeka gets a lot of views for our stuff. But like what Lauren said, and to echo Meredith, like a lot of the work we're doing is not just our focus of other community members like Paul Hibbets or Tom Woodward or Alan Levine or you name it. But then also like people who maybe don't really know or care about Reclaim Hosting also have the ability to do a search and to find it. And a lot of the reason why they're finding it is other people are commenting there, are creating there, are linking there. So it's a virtuous cycle of the web, and keeping all that documentation open and online and available really does like make it feel also different for us writing it.
Right.
Like we're writing resources, not just for us immediately internally, but for a broader audience who could possibly use it.
Right. And I think it goes back to, that idea of the community documentation is what the community makes it. I think it's at this point, it's no longer just up to us to keep everything up to date and to manage it, but it really is a group effort where folks will go in and say, I think, FYI, this is now out of date. This was written in 2016 and there's now a software update. And so we'll get those sorts of additions to older documentation as well. And that's cool to see, in addition to just, what we're writing for our internal workflow. So.
And I think one of the interesting things about documentation, and it's a struggle that we as a group who are trying to support many universities, many faculty, many students, both in a very like one-to-one relationship, but also as one-to-many of like a technologist or a community that's supporting thousands of students working with this, is how do you get documentation not only available to as wide an audience as possible, but also focused for different environments that use it. And, Discourse has been a very interesting first run at a solution, but it's one of the struggles I think any group has is, how are you able to kind of, what do they say, localize your documentation for specific communities at specific times so it makes sense. Like if you're a shared hosting user, you don't care about domain of one's own per se at a university. And if you're a university domain of one's own user, you're not so interested about our client for shared hosting. So our ability to manage the two has also been good. And like Meredith, you linked to earlier, is we do community shared hosting mostly for the community site, although it can be domain of one's own as well. But we have a whole separate instance of a workshop where we really start to detail and write specific documentation for administrators of domain of one's own schools. That is a whole nother beast in some ways, but that's all WordPress. That's not Discourse. And that's an interesting distinction we're making. Why WordPress for that versus Discourse for the shared hosting community is probably a good point to think about.
No, it definitely is. And I don't think that there was, a conscious decision in the beginning to say, we're going to build out domain of one's own administrator documentation in WordPress because we don't want them talking to each other. I don't think that there was ever that, that decision was never made. It was just at the time we were starting this workshop. It was Workshop of One's Own in Fredericksburg. And as our way of summarizing the work that we were talking about, we wanted to make sure everything we were teaching was written somewhere. So one, folks didn't feel like they had to take notes during the discussions, that they could actually be present and know that everything that was talked about was already recorded. And I still use that phrase and that way to make new admins feel comfortable in my trainings, that, hey, this is already written. And so as a result, we just kind of came up with this, it became this hub of information, and we found that admins were going to it regularly, and being able to support a community at large. You have folks like Tom Woodward, or I guess he's WordPress multi-site, but still, you've got these 2 or 3 team members that are supporting an entire community. And the only way they can do that is that they have to, they can't rely on us for everything. They have to be able to feel empowered to do this work themselves. And the best way to do that is to have guides in place. And so, that said, in Discourse, there is a domain of one's own section that I do think works and pairs really nicely with the documentation. So you've got the documentation that's written for administrators, that's kept separate from shared hosting because it is separate. But then at the same time, this domain of one's own section in Discourse, I like to think of it as a place where folks can go and say, how is everybody approaching, the upgrade to WordPress, or Omeka versus Omeka S? What's the best, option here? Or how do we work with faculty members who are digging their heels in to the idea of domains and making their classes digitized to some extent? So I like to think of it as almost an advice column, or a place where they can go and connect with other domain of one's own administrators with ease.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And frankly, I hadn't thought about it before we got on to talking about this. Like, we do have the domain of one's own section on that Discourse forum, and Discourse is an open source, software that's used pretty broadly now for forums. But sometimes, there are a lot of administrators who just want the documentation, who just want that, who, aren't necessarily in need of or desire that kind of back and forth. But you're right, the two are serving a similar purpose, but in different ways based on what you need from the community. I particularly like the WordPress documentation just because it allows us, when we're teaching or when we're doing these workshops, to have an organized space where we can link to people. So someone comes on a ticket and they're like, hey, I've had issues with, WHMCS or
right.
cPanel, some instance. We have a documentation guide that we can quickly link to a group of people.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
And that kind of brings up, the other part of this. If we come back to why we're here, what we're talking about, it's this idea of being able to scale and being a team of 7 now, and being able to
7 of us.
Way more than that, and to do it productively and efficiently, without recreating the wheel over and over again. So while, we get the same kinds of questions from domain of one's own administrators, they're essentially clones of each other, right? And for all intents and purposes. And so you've got these questions that we get regularly, and instead of rewriting the answer out in the how-to steps in every single support ticket, it's more efficient to write it once and then link back to it. So there are some instances, where we can expect admins to go in and search for their own, resolutions to tickets and things on the admin site, and that's there for them. But in other ways, it's nice to have so we can link to it. And that's, what I use for my follow-up emails all the time. I'll put together a training and then say, hey, listen, I talked about X, Y, and Z, and here are very quick links to that. And then, oh yeah, I even recorded an entire training, and here's that link as well. So being able to just kind of minimize the overlap of work, and I think makes our life easier internally as well.
It's interesting.
Absolutely. And
I'm sorry, go ahead, Meredith.
No, that's okay. So I was going to kind of touch on how the WordPress documentation for the domain of one's own folks is more technical in the sense of it's step-by-step of processes, like creating a new account on the server, or moving account ownership and that sort of thing. And that's great to have. And they kind of echoing what you were talking about, Jim, is that the community side of domain of one's own is more of just a discussion conversation. And so I think that WordPress there works well for us because it's the same, like Lauren was saying, the same situations as well. So
It's
yeah.
an interesting too distillation process. So a
Mhm.
lot of what we're doing as a team. So let's just talk about Reclaim, right? Like as a team, we're trying to push each other to learn stuff that we've done, because a lot of our job requires learning on the fly, getting hit with different questions about various applications that we're not always experts on.
Okay.
And one of the way we're able to document that is just personally, like sharing out what we've learned, right? And that's usually informal through a blog or some format. And then what happens is when you do that personally, you obviously, I use it as a documentation I can go to and reference later. So when I hit the problem again, like I do that all the time with command line stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember ever. So I document it on my blog and then I come back to it and I use that post again and again. But it's interesting because now we're getting to the point where we're taking each other's blog posts and those are being distilled as a document in both community and
Right.
sometimes within the admin workshop for the domain of one's own administrators. And for me, that's a very virtuous cycle
Absolutely.
of pushing people to learn on their own and document so they have it, but then like kind of almost processing that into a documentation more broadly for our community.
And the same is true for support tickets. I mean, just the other day, Jim,
Mm-hmm.
it was actually yesterday morning, I was coming on support, you were getting off support, and you had fixed a ticket about a PHP CLI error in Omeka, and you linked to, I think, the Stack Overflow forum that you found for it, that you did, you taught yourself how to fix it and put it as an internal note in the ticket. And then from there, I took that and pushed it to community as an internal document for our team. So it's always being in that mindset of how can we spread the news, right? If I am if I'm teaching myself something and I've from scratch, or chances are someone else has those same questions. And so I think it's just developing a dynamic where at Reclaim where you don't feel like there's any silly questions, or that nothing is too silly to write about, right? Because if you have the question and if it took you time to solve, that's important, and that's learning that's being done. And so it's important to either blog about it or put it somewhere where other people can learn from what you did too. And so and then everyone's obviously in the habit of checking Discourse and checking that search bar for any kind of how-to article. So being able to take an internal support note and put that as a support art, documentation. If we get this ticket again, here's exactly the way to solve it. So it's just being really, I guess, strict about communicating all of that.
It's interesting too, because while you were talking about it, it made me think about like some of our structures to make this happen, right? The fact that you went into that and then turned it into a community document is awesome. And I had no idea. So A, ruling, but then B, it's like we have run into challenges with the tools that, everyone's talking about as they're doing remote learning right now, right? Like we use Slack.
Mm-hmm.
But we've run into the difficulties of Slack. Slack is horrible for documentation like this.
Right.
It gets lost in the flow, and then you'll never find it again. So we need Discourse or we need WordPress. The other thing is lists of things to do.
Right.
We needed that, and Lauren, you recommended this very early, but a tool like Asana, where it's not a tool where I'm going to go necessarily for documentation on how to do something. It's going to go where I'm going to check what I need to do or what's been done on a particular project or task.
Right.
And it's a very different tool, as is Slack. Slack's really good for in-the-moment updates and notifications, so you're not depending on email, but it's terrible for documentation.
Right.
And same with Asana. Like, that's not where you're going to document stuff.
Right. And I think just kind of a tip in general for folks that are moving to sort of this distributed work as a team, you're working from home now, you're researching new tools to kind of take the place of your in-person workflows and that sort of thing. It's really important, I think, for us at Reclaim, it has been to really define what the tools is meant to do, like what the tool is meant to do, where are the limitations, how are we using it, and is it for the right reasons? Are we just trying to use it because it's a function, it's a cool function of the tool, and we're trying to add it to, you know, our workflows, but it doesn't really, it's not, you know, a great example was Trainual. You know, it was like we tried to use that as an internal way to train our employees, but it was overkill with discourse. And so I think it's important to talk about, okay, we tried to integrate tools and it wasn't successful for that reason, because we were not using it the way that it was meant to be used. And as a result, it was an extra step and people weren't adopting it, and it didn't work. But and the same thing is true for Asana. I've got a blog post coming about just how we've changed with using Asana. In the beginning, if you go back and read my blog post from 2016, where I first talk about integrating Asana, we started using it as a CRM. I was actually taking Tim and Jim's spreadsheets of our new contracts and our new schools that we were getting that they had put in spreadsheets. And I said, okay, there's no search bar in a spreadsheet. There's no way to update that or see when people updated it. It was a mess. So we moved it into Asana, and that became nice for the time being. But again, we needed a CRM. And there was a while where Asana didn't really gain traction at Reclaim because we were using it for the wrong reasons. And it wasn't until we said, okay, no, this is going to be a public to-do list. It's a place where we can track the progress of different projects and have both individual to-do lists, but then also, you know, external projects that everybody's managing. That's when it blew up. And now, you know, it's so integrated in how we use, you know, or how we function at Reclaim. The same is true for Slack. You know, we tried to make that our place where we were note taking and, you know, keeping track of projects. And once we realized the limitations of Slack as, okay, this is a great substitute for something like email. You know, we can get notifications for support tickets and we can communicate on a day-to-day basis. But everything else needs to be outside of Slack, you know? And so I think just that is crucial. Sorry for the
agree.
but that's
okay.
It reminded me. Go ahead.
You're bringing up Trainual because I honestly wasn't even going to talk about that, because that was kind of more of like a my project, in the sense that, like, as I was coming on, even months before that, as we were starting to hire new employees, I was like, oh, we need something that, like, is a quick way just to disseminate information on, like, what you need to know kind of off the bat. And then we found that people were not referring back to Trainual, what was written in Trainual for processes after the initial, like, 2-week training period we did. And a lot of, like, solid information is in there that once you memorize it, you don't really need to go back. Or, like, if you just need to, like, if you're like, oh, like, how do I, like, fix permissions? I know there's just, like, one guide on, like, the commands. Like, when we refer back to it, people weren't, like, they were going to Slack to ask those questions. They weren't going back to Trainual. So that was a little kind of hard pill to swallow once they accepted that Trainual was no longer a thing.
I definitely didn't mean that as a specific failure.
No.
I think that,
I don't take it that way anyway either, because, like, it's more of, like, a movement and growth period, or not growth period, more growth in the sense that we're learning all the time. And then that same environment of Reclaim is that we're pushing each other to learn in that aspect.
Yeah, I think it's important to have an open dialogue, you know, and again, it comes back to how we function at Reclaim. It's being able to say, okay, what is working and what's not working and why.
Yeah.
You know, Trainual is an awesome tool. There were a lot of cool features to it, and we enjoyed, you know, putting together the co-founders podcast and things like that to put in Trainual, but it didn't stick. And talking about why that is, you know, is just as important about talking about why things do stick, you know?
We've struggled with that. Trainual won't be the first time, right? We've struggled with that with Kid HR, trying to set up some sort of HR application, but we're not really using it because we really use Gusto for most of that stuff. And that's a whole nother discussion of other applications we use. But the other thing is, like, let's say, for example, with Zendesk, which is our bread and butter for support. That's our support ticketing system. So we use Zendesk. But we have tried to document stuff in tickets. We have tried to do that. But again, like, Zendesk runs into the same problems that Slack did, is that you only look at that ticket for as long as that ticket's up. At the point it's solved, that ticket goes away. So the idea of taking stuff out of, the stuff that's basically time sensitive and putting into a place where it can be searched like a database, which our forum discourse has become, is a really important practice that's taken us years to figure out.
Literally.
And
Absolutely.
And it's taken us years to figure out how to use Asana. Frankly, like you said, 2016, we were using it as a customer relationship management tool, and now we're using it for everything in terms of project management. So that's a radically different approach.
Right.
So I think the tools, they're fluid, and I think the point that you made, Lauren, is a super good one. It's like, try and come up with a definition of how you use that tool, and then see if it works. The problem in my mind with Trainual is not that it wasn't a good tool, it's a great tool, but when you have too many places you're going for things, that becomes an issue. Like, if I'm thinking I'm going to look for support documentation in Trainual, when I know that we've been using Discourse and it works,
right,
it's going to be a lot less likely, because then I'm thinking I got to go 2 places now, and that's when those I guess those lines aren't clear. It's like, what is in Trainual versus what's in Discourse? And that's when it all breaks down. Because then you're like, I'm going to find another way. I'm going to resort to the help channel in chat, Slack, which is good, but someone's going to link you to one of those things anyway. So, like, you've got to, I think, also being able to say at the same time, no, we got to limit, we got to minimize, so there's no confusion. And so that's always a struggle.
And I mean, we're definitely not perfect. I think it's important that we're always open to suggestions, and that's what I'm really proud about Reclaim. We have weekly check-ins where we say what is working, what is not working. And so being able to always accept that feedback, even, the other day, there was an internal documentation article, Meredith, that you found for me, and Zendesk support that I didn't even know existed because I was checking Discourse. So there's still, cleaning up that we are constantly doing, but just being open and flexible to new solutions, but also knowing, like, okay, that it's that balance of, is this something we need, or would this be just an extra tool? And that's an important conversation that we have quite often at Reclaim.
Absolutely. So kind of shifting, we talked about the internal documentation we have, the administrator documentation we have, and now kind of shifting into the end user documentation we have for students and users in Domain of One Zone. And that's kind of really where I think that we as Reclaim set up our admins well, is we have those 3 separate pieces of documentation, so then that way they're comfortable with the work that we've been doing and the environment that we set up to then teach their students. So we have schools like BYU, really a great example. They just took off with Domain of One Zone and have thousands of users, tens of thousands of users on them. And so as part of that, they have this like documentation website, which we give a base to for all our new clients, all our new schools. And they have created their own documentation world to show students and users of the platform, like specifically how to work with WordPress, how to work with Omeka, how, like, what to name your domain type deal. And so that base, I just kind of want to talk about that base of WordPress and the documentation that we write as the starting point.
It's interesting. I'll go first, Lauren. I know you have tons to say, so I will start you and then say.
No, yeah, go for it.
But the one thing that's interesting and worth noting is, I don't know how many years ago, you can fill me in the details on that, Lauren, but like, I want to say 3 years ago, 4 years ago, like, we didn't really, maybe less, we didn't really send out documentation with Domain of One Zone. We trained schools, like the admins, And then they kind of were like, hey, and Adam Kroom at the University of Oklahoma and the good folks there like John Stewart and Keegan basically were like, look, we have documentation. We cloned what we had done for Middlebury. That might be something you all at Reclaim want to do for other schools. So there's a perfect example of that whole idea of the community stepping forward and doing stuff, because we're a pretty how would you say, skeleton crew, right? We're supporting thousands of people with at that point it was probably 3-4 people at most, and like we didn't have the headspace to have full-blown documentation given all the other stuff we were doing while we were growing. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but it was super beautiful that Oklahoma, Adam and folks stepped up and said, this is great. You can clone it in a WordPress site, and then you can deliver that to the universities who need it. And it's a really nice thing that we really can't take credit for. What we did is just started giving it away alongside, the generosity of Oklahoma. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, in the beginning, when we first set it up, you can, if for anybody watching or listening, you can see it at stateu.org/docs is kind of the templated documentation that we're talking about here. And it was originally, Adam wrote a blog post about it. And I remember in the beginning, probably 4 years ago at this point, following Adam's guide on, installing the duplicator plugin and the text and replace plugin and the Velvet URLs plugin to change all of these, to kind of clone things over and then add in, text for a specific university. And so right now, that's kind of what we've been doing, is just saying, okay, here is this baseline of documentation. And at this point, it's not perfect because you can argue that it's now out of date. We haven't done too much to it since it was given to us. I mean, we've gone in and updated a few things, but there's always this balance of wanting to provide for the community the best that we can, but then also realizing that each domain of one's own instance, and each school has a separate set of policies. They're supporting different things. Not every school is going to offer every application or offer top level domains. Some are only going to offer subdomains and only offer WordPress and Omeka. So right off the bat, the documentation articles are not going to look the same. And it's not necessarily Reclaim's position to write that out for the school when we don't know their policies. So that's always been our struggle, I think, is just trying to have a balance of saying, what can we offer? We don't want to recreate the wheel. We want to have the community, folks like Oklahoma or BYU or whoever who's already written incredible documentation. If they're willing to share it, Coventry's another great example. Lauren Haywood, and Noah, Daniel, they just put out this new space called, I think it's coventry.domain/learn, where theirs is more of a conceptual documentation, which is kind of a whole other tangent to get into, this conceptual piece versus the how-to, what's more important. And so this is kind of a big conversation that Reclaim is currently tackling right now. We actually just sent out a survey to a lot of our domain of one's own administrators, and we're starting to think about, okay, we want to update this documentation, but we also want to involve the community and put it in a place where everybody can make updates to it. And it's not, just sort of held and then cloned out by Reclaim, but really in more of this malleable format that can be updated and pushed out to everyone. And then also doing that in a way that, is not going to have school specific text. So that gets really hairy. And so I'm really proud of the work that we have done so far, but I'm also saying that I think we have a lot of room to grow in this category as well.
That's been the struggle. I mean, on that documentation point, and I'll tell you, this has been a pain point since we started. We were working as early as 2013 with Mike Caulfield to try and think about how, at that point, DocuWiki, he then went on to use a tool called Smallest Federated Wiki. But we were thinking back in 2013 about how we could somehow create easily not only established, maybe we'll call white label documentation, so anyone could use them, but then allow people to localize and customize that. And Mike Caulfield's idea, which was a good one, was you could basically use transclusion with wikis and take what was a page, move it into another wiki, and have that, and then edit it, but still be able to sync some of that stuff back that people wanted to bring back into the community, which was where the smallest federated wiki came in. Not getting too technical, this is what GitHub does a lot for code. GitHub allows people to make recommendations like, hey, here's my documentation, and people will suggest, hey, here's a request I have, or here's a change I'm suggesting, and then you can integrate that change or not. And our idea is, how do we get documentation in a space or to a space where we can have some kind of baseline white labeled documentation for folks to use, but then allow them easily to take what they want, leave what they don't, and then customize what they have. And it's a real tricky technological, really, it's a tricky technical challenge, not to mention the cultural challenge of having people actually do it. Right. But it's an interesting technical challenge. Now, the work that Lauren Haywood did with just getting us up and running with unbelievable philosophical approaches to domain of one's own versus the kind of, how would you say, how-to approaches to using subdomains or whatever is something we could use and could adapt. So we'll be stealing from the community once again, I think.
Yeah, I love the documentation that Lauren and Noah wrote. And if there's anyone else who wrote that I'm missing, I apologize. But, those articles are much more about, okay, best practices in the online world, copyright rules, acceptable use policies, digital literacy, the why around domain of one's own. Why are we here? Whereas the articles in stateu/docs is much more, okay, how do I sign up for an account? And what are the refund policies, or, that kind of thing. So if you think about signing up for an account, okay, guys, go to stateu.org and you're going to sign up for a subdomain on, student.stateu.org. Well, every school is going to have a different project URL. So all screenshots are going to look different. The portal's going to look different. And so how do you write these how-to articles that everyone can share while also making it, I guess, kind of not school specific, right? And so that's the hard challenge. And so far, we've just kind of used generic text like stateu and then said to the administrators, listen, this is a baseline of documentation. It's a template that now you can go in and update with your school name and your screenshots. And through that process, the administrators end up learning the system better because they're going through the workflows and the documentation. So there is value there. But, if you're handing out documentation, you want it to alleviate the workload and not create more work. And so it's a double-edged sword. And I don't think that there's necessarily one right way forward. But we're open to suggestions.
I do think, though, I think I agree, but the other side of that is where we had none, now we have a really robust look at managing cPanel, managing file manager, using domains, thinking through these applications. It's a really great start for an administrator who may not, and many of them don't, particularly now, have the time and energy to sit down and write all that. That would take weeks. And now a lot of that work is done, and it would still take time to update screenshots and stuff. But I do think, to Oklahoma's great credit, the work they did and the work they shared has saved hours, if not weeks, of time for many people out there. And I think that's it's just another kind of another reason to share and be open. Absolutely. I think another place we can go with this, if you two are open with that, is thinking about, that's how we try and help schools on the ground who are putting documentation out to for faculty and students to use domain of one's own. But one of the things we started doing 2 years ago, I think, or a year and a half ago now, is actually going to these regional locations. And we were going to do one or a modification of one for OER20, but unfortunately that didn't happen, is the idea of on-the-ground workshops for regional domain of one's own administrators to get not only very detailed support around how to manage our infrastructure, which for an administrator is not all that easy. It's pretty easy for a user who's bam, sign in, single sign on, there's your cPanel, go.
Right.
But for an administrator, there's some overhead. And so we tried to alleviate some of that by having these in-person meetings at various universities, Skidmore, Emerson, Michigan State. And we were going to have one in Bryn Mawr, but that's probably going to be rescheduled or canceled given the state of the union right now. But that's another way. And we've also started to integrate, Lauren, the idea of sharing what's going on at your school with other administrators. Right. In this very usually 10 to 15 administrators from various schools who could find out what each other are doing, right? I mean, that's been a really nice development and support that we didn't have before. And it's very localized and it feels very much in line with the theme of caring, right? It feels like we're on the ground with them, we're hanging out with them.
Yeah, that was sort of our, those started in, I think, 2017 or 2018 with the idea of workshop of one's own. And that's what we called it in the beginning. And we invited schools to come to Fredericksburg, to the Reclaim hosting office headquarters and work with the whole Reclaim team. And that was great. We did 2 of them, but they were also very intense and exhausting, and they involved the entire team. And, we needed to find something that was a balance. So what we ended up doing was Jim and I went on the road and started taking these workshops on the road to various areas that had a lot of domain of one's own schools with a lot of interest for learning and training. And so we called it, or are now calling it, Roadshow. So the Reclaim Roadshow workshop. And these have gained a lot of traction. And I really like it because it's just another way that we are, involving the community and facilitating a space where folks can contribute. You really can't beat in-person training. You just can't. As much as I love the digital world and meetings like this, it's just something about that dedicated time for 2 days to, ask questions. And then, so not only is the first day very technical, where we're giving that overview of domains and saying, have you thought about this, or the potential of this, being able to use splots, or thinking about, exit strategies and cleaning up, after a few years, what that looks like, and just general overview of the systems. But then on day 2, it's much more focused around, okay, now we know what domain of one's own is. Why are we here? What's the potential? What are other schools doing? What should I be doing? What hasn't worked? What has worked? And so that's really, Jim and I will talk in the morning, but then we'll also open up a panel where we'll bring in other really experienced domain of one's own administrators, and then have just a lot of room for discussion throughout the course of that day, where you've got a lot of perspective and experience in the room from varying degrees of domain of one's own schools. So Skidmore was a great example, where we had the workshop at Skidmore. There were folks in the room that had been doing domain of one's own for a couple of years, like Plymouth University. But then you also had, a few schools that were in the room that didn't even have domain of one's own, that were just considering it. And so you were able to, Jim and I think we all at Reclaim can realize that there's only so much we can talk about. We can talk about our product, we can talk about what we do to support it and how to work within it and manage it, but we can't talk about the experiences that happen on campus, on the ground, with the students and faculty, because we're not there. And so being able to provide that space where these, administrators could talk about, issues that they met with their budget, or, issues that they met with faculty members who didn't want to use this, or workshops that they were doing on their own time and involving their students. Muhlenberg is a great example of that. UNW is a great example of that, and this peer-to-peer tutoring. So anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I do think that those workshops are really helpful as just another way to involve the community and get the conversation happening outside of Reclaim.
And I think that's right. And I think, I mean, to link this back to OER20, like, I am really thankful that they give us this online space to do this. But I do miss the fact that we would be there breaking bread with people.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the roadshow that's nice is like we have dinner together one night, we'll have lunch. And like, it's just a way to just find out what's happening with these schools and what their challenges, because it's very easy to kind of just become this like,
Support
this is
bot.
what we do, right? Yeah, you're just a support bot. We provide a thing. We don't want to know about your context. We don't care about how you're using it. And I feel like we really get connected to the actual uses, because the thing I like about domains, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but the thing I like about it is there's no one way to use it. It's hosting, right? Like you can have a library using it in this way. You can have a, very academic course-based structure using it in this way. You can have an administrative structure using it in this way. I mean, it's a multi-headed hydra of possibilities, and that's a good thing. And so I think you really don't get a sense of how your own tool is being used until you talk with the people who are using it and the ways they're using it. And the roadshows have been amazing for that. So
equally valuable for the administrators as they are for us, because then we're able to come back and get a sense of the questions that are being asked on campus, and we can then turn around and say, okay, support team or infrastructure, this is a big pain point that we never knew even existed. And so when folks are asking these questions on support tickets, it's actually because of this reason over here that we didn't even know. And so is there a way that we can link that together in infrastructure or support? Can you change your wording to, frame it like this, which is easier to just unpack, and so, yeah, I think the more we can do like these roadshows to just hear the community and get a sense of how the product is being used outside of, our idea of what we want it to be, I think just keeps us grounded. It keeps us in touch, and again, allows us to, better maintain and monitor for everyone else. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think Reclaim is so special in that way, is that we're not like corporate in the sense that it's like we're behind the screen and that's the only interaction you have with us over the phone and the screen. There's no like, although we are a remote company and like we are behind the screen, like even right now, like I think we make that effort to make it more personable and like being in person and like doing like conferences like this. Like I love the fact that OER is happening because it gives us a chance to kind of catch up and just see and like even brainstorm just like more ideas to like improve the product, or not even product, but like improve the view of domain of one's own, and give it that personality and that personable aspect to it.
And we were so jazzed. Do you remember how jazzed we were after we came back from OER19?
Yeah.
Like we were energized. We had seen the people who we talked to on those tickets. They all had faces. They were people who we know, and many of them I do know. And, now I know them better or differently, or have a better insight just because we were able to spend that time. So it does, I don't want to mourn OER20 too much because it's still happening, but that time and that space was valuable, and it is valuable. So that's the roadshow. That's a big one. Last thing, I think I'm mindful of time because we're creeping up on an hour. Mm-hmm. But I think if we're talking about the last thing of like personal face-to-face, like making things easier, like whether it's support for the admins through the workshop, or the roadshow, or it's the documentation that Oklahoma was so generous to share with us. The final piece maybe worth talking about would be, and you mentioned them, Lauren, splots. Like one other tool that has kind of developed over the last year and a half in coordination in conjunction with Alan Levine has been, and Coventry again has made great use of these as other schools have, has been getting up and running with very focused teaching or sharing tools that are built on top of an application. Most of the splots Alan builds are built on top of WordPress. But the idea, I think the core abstract idea is, can we as a community come up with these kind of very focused teaching tools or sharing tools or whatever you want to call them that people can install very quickly, have the theme and the kind of innards of that site, whether it be plugins, themes, functions, whatever, are designed so that people can use them to quickly get up and running on a portfolio or sharing resources, etc. And Splots have been a great way, as you said, Meredith, to make us getting onboarding and people up and running easier. And that's in great part to the work Alan Levine has done with his stuff. But does that make sense?
Definitely. And I think that it's one of my favorite things is to see folks take the Splots that have already been offered, right, and use that almost as a slingshot for thinking about ways that they can create their own on campus. And I think Wake Forest is a great example of that. I know that there are a few other schools that are doing similar things, but basically, I think Connecticut College did one. Anyway, there's where the schools have basically said, okay, we really like these templated sites that we can use. And we also have found another need. We want to create one for, an e-portfolio for our bios class that needs, to publish research behind a password protected page. And they're not so much concerned with building that site, but they just need to spin it up quickly to put their research out there in a classroom environment that, their very close community can see without publishing it for the world to see. And so those kind of niche cases or very specific use cases, I'm seeing that these schools are turning them into these templates that can be cloned and used throughout domain of one's own. So I find that that's really helpful too. And it's just a great way to see, okay, here's the work that's being done by the community, but then here's how it's being built upon as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things Splots, when they were first kind of, imagined, right? And Tom Woodward and Martha Burtis, I think, were doing what might be considered like proto Splots or early visions of Splots using like gravity forms in WordPress and basically using WordPress as the backend for like a fully developed application, right? Where a faculty could go in and create a database of information from their students. And they're really like smart, like hacks of WordPress. And I think Brian Lamb and Alan Levine then came along and they said like, well, we have WordPress for faculty, but sometimes even WordPress, as great as it is a kind of barrier to entry because it's just a blank theme, a blank post, and people aren't really like jumping in. They're seeing it. They kind of like, oh my God, I got to invest X amount of time. I'm done. Whereas Brian and Alan had the idea of what if we had something that was fully formed, right? Like Athena from Zeus's head. And it comes out, and as soon as you're ready to go, like exactly what you're using it for, whether it's for a writing tool, what you're using it, whether it's collecting resources like images, what you're using for, like whether it's a portfolio, and everything's just clear. And you go there, and then you learn how to use the tool. I mean, it's still a little bit of overhead, but frankly, it's even easier than learning WordPress, if that's possible. Like, it's really like fill out a form, you have a post, you never have to log in. You can be anonymous as a student or as a faculty member, and it has a lot of actually benefits if you don't want to be tracked or if you don't want to identify students or users. It's kind of against the logic of a lot of the ed tech out there. And so we were lucky enough to be able to work with Alan to get that stuff, that it's another option alongside WordPress is a modified version of, WordPress or a modified version of, mostly WordPress, but you could imagine Omeka or Scalar or some other tool. Like the logic is the same. It's just like you're taking an open source tool and you're modding it like a custom car or a custom, whatever to do one specific thing. And that's a really cool development that I think, to get back to the original question, Meredith, allows us to scale a little bit of possibilities. Right. And that means less training on the part of ed tech, less overhead for faculty when they have enough to do. And so these small teaching tools, whatever we want to call them, I think Tom Woodward calls them tiny teaching tools. They make for just another option amongst many. Right. That whole idea of the tool set. Right. Like domain of one's own at its best, is a chest of possibilities for people to pick and choose and explore and figure out what works for them. It's not a turnkey solution. It never can be. That's why as the things hit, it makes sense right now is everybody's hunkered down that like you don't traipse out domains and say like, hey, you have a million options. You can do whatever you want online. Like people don't not want to hear that right now. They want to know, what do I need to do? I have to teach online. Stop. So like it would be a silly time for us to be like, oh, we have a solution. But I do think every user and every faculty member, once they're have moved beyond the baseline, do want to explore what else is possible. And I think having those tools that are fairly simple and easy for people to get up and running goes a long way towards making them building their own presence online that much more viable and sustainable, which I think is that balance between scaling and, you know, just experimenting, right? You have to make this stuff sustainable for people to use, or else, you know, you're kind of just, what do they say? Playing fiddle while Rome is burning. Like you don't want to do that, especially now.
That's like the orchestra on the Titanic playing as it sinks.
Oh God.
We definitely don't want to do that. No.
No.
No. Well, cool. I think we are reaching an hour, but I appreciate the discussion here. This was actually great. Went in directions that I wasn't expecting. So I was glad for the conversation. So thank you. And thanks for everyone listening or watching. And we will chat online through OER20.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
See ya.